Hello students. So in our today's module, we'll be studying about fragmentation, right, and vegetative propagation. So now first of all, we should know that what exactly do we mean by fragmentation. Now students, in this method, the body of a simple multicellular organism breaks up into smaller pieces on maturation. So what happens? This happens only after maturation. Right, after maturation, not accidentally. So when a multicellular organism it becomes mature, then it breaks up into smaller pieces, right? And then what happens? Each fragment develops into new individual. For example, you can see here in Spirogyra, this is a multicellular body, fine, of Spirogyra. You can see two fragments. And then what happens? Each fragment give rise to a new Spirogyra. Fine. So this is what the fragmentation is. Now students, this is not true for all multicellular organisms. They cannot simply divide cell by cell. And the reason is that many multicellular organisms, as we have seen, are not simply a random collection of cells. Specialized cells are organized as tissue and tissue are organized as organs, which then have to be placed at definite position in the body. In such a carefully organized situation, cell by cell division would be impractical. So multicellular organisms therefore need to use more complex ways of reproduction, right? Now students, a basic strategy used in multicellular organism is that different cell types perform different specialized functions. So this was all about fragmentation. Moving on to the next one, that is vegetative propagation. Students, in this method, new plants, they are produced from the vegetative part. Now, what is this vegetative part? It can be root, it can be stem, or it can be leaf. Fine. So, these are the vegetative part with the help of which a new plant can be produced. For example, from root, sweet potato, from stem potato, ginger, from leaf, the example is bryophyllum. As you can see here in the diagram, this is the leaf of bryophyllum. Fine. Now this bryophyllum leaves you can see with buds, lot of buds are here, which ultimately give rise to new bryophyllum. Fine. Students, remember one thing, vegetative propagation can also be done artificially just by cutting, layering or grafting, etc. Now, coming on to the next topic, that is the sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Students, first of all, we should know that what exactly do we mean by sexual reproduction? Fine, and that we all know. Fine, where the two parents are involved. Now, students, the reproductive parts of angiosperms, they are located in the flower only. Fine. And the stamen and pistils are the reproductive part of the flower. Stamen is the male reproductive part and it produces pollen grains in the anther, fine, which contains the male germ cell, that is the male gamete. I'm talking about pistil, it is the female reproductive part that I'm going to show you with the red color. It is the female reproductive part, students. Pistil is the female reproductive part. It produces ovules in the ovary, fine, which contains the female germ cell, or we can say the female gamete. So you can see here clearly in this picture that we have the stamen. Where is stamen located? This one is stamen. So when we actually combine anther and filament, this is said to be the stamen. That is the male gamete. Fine. So you can see here, in the stamen, we have a bilobe-like structure that is known as anther, right students? And this elongated filament, this elongated like structure is filament. So anther and filament, they together known as stamen, which is a male gamete. Similarly, students, we have a female gamete. You can see here, this one we have is stigma, which is quite sticky in nature. the elongated tube-like structure you can see here, the elongated one. This is style, and you can see the basal portion, this is ovary. Fine. So stigma, style and ovary, and together they are said to be pistil. And this pistil is the female reproductive part, and the stamen is male reproductive part. So I hope this thing is clear to each one of you students. Let me just erase it for you now. So you can see here, apart from the male and female gamete, we have petals, which are basically for the attraction, for the pollination purpose, because we all have studied this thing in our 7th standard that for fertilization to occur, they need the process that is pollination, right? Now students, you can see here that we have the basal portions, like we have receptacles and peduncle, fine, which is the lowermost portion of the flower, okay. And you can see here within the ovary we have an embryo sac that is said to be the ovule. So you can see here in this portion, this is where actually the female gametophyte is present and the fertilization occurs. Fine. So these are the basic parts of the flower, the reproductive part. Now students, remember one thing, that we all know this thing now, that stamen is the male reproductive part, fine, and it produces pollen grains. Let me just tell you, see, this one is stamen, fine. So within the anther, you can see the bilobe like structure. This is anther, and within this anther students, pollen grains are produced, fine. Pollen grains are produced, which are basically the male gamete only, fine. And this pollen grain is basically present inside the anther only, fine, and that are yellowish in color. You must have seen this yellowish powder that often sticks to your hand if we touch the stamen of a flower, right? And similarly, carpel or pistil, the other name of pistil is carpel, fine. So pistil, carpel, one and the same thing, which is the female gamete, and it comprises of stigma, style and ovary. I hope this thing is clear students. Now we need a process that is known as pollination, because the transfer of pollen grains is to be done from this anther to the stigma, and this can be achieved by a very amazing, I would say, process that is said to be the pollination, which is very important process. Without this, obviously fertilization is not possible. So what is pollination? The transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower is said to be pollination. So I would like to show you here in my previous slide that you can see here. Now this one, remember one thing students, that flower, it may be unisexual or bisexual. Unisexual means when the sexes are separate. The male gamete is like in one flower and the female gamete is in another flower. But they can be bisexual as well. When it comes like both the stamen and carpel, they are present within the same flower, fine. And the example of unisexual, we have papaya, watermelon, and talking about bisexual, we have hibiscus, mustard. I hope I am clear students. Now what exactly happens? The pollen grains, like for example, let me just erase it for you so that you can better understand it students. All right, now so you can see here anther, where exactly the lot of pollen grains they are formed, fine. Now what will happen? Through any agencies, like we have wind, fine, through any insect. So through these agencies, what exactly happens? That the pollen grains that have been formed inside this anther, they have to, obviously they need to be transported or transferred from this very place, that is the anther, to the stigma. Fine. So the transfer of this pollen grain from anther to the stigma, fine, it's said to be pollination, because this is the male gamete and this is the female gamete. So you can see here, it takes place by wind, water, or insect. You can see here is a butterfly which sits and taking up the nectar, fine, and then what happens? All the pollen grain, they get stick to their body. Then what will happen? This butterfly will transfer somehow the pollen grains which get stuck to the butterfly's body from this anther to the stigma. Now students, if the pollen grains, they are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, remember this thing, transferring is done, but within the same flower it's said to be self pollination. For example, you can see here, fine, this is the stigma, this is the anther. So if it is something like this, then it is said to be self pollination, right? But in cross pollination, you can see from one flower to the other, fine. So this is what the cross pollination is. I hope I am clear, students. So if it is transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, is said to be cross pollination. And remember one thing, that pollination takes place by insect, wind, water, etc. Now students, talking about the fertilization. So after the pollen grain is transferred to the stigma, we know this thing, that these, you can see here, these are the pollen grain, student, which has the outer covering, fine, and it has the protein also, that is known as sporopollen, which basically protect this pollen grain from any kind of harsh or weather condition, fine. So once this pollen grain is reached to the sticky portion, that is stigma, fine. So what will happen? This pollen grain, they basically produces a pollen tube. Remember this thing, a pollen tube, fine, which passes through the style. This is style, students. You can see here, this one is style, the long elongated tube. So this passes through the style and finally enters the ovary and ovule. So you can see here now, I would like to show you this thing with the help of red color. See, you can see here, it passes through the style and enters the ovary. So this is the ovary. Within this ovary, you can see here we have an embryo sac. Fine. So this is embryo sac. Fine. So we have an ovary. Then within ovary, we have an ovule, which is known as embryo sac. I hope I am clear, students. Now, what happens? In the ovule, within the ovule, what happens? The male germ cells. So within this pollen tube, you can see this pollen tube. This pollen tube has two male gamete. Fine. They further divide and this results into the formation of two sperm nuclei. Now, in the ovule, the male germ cell or the male gamete fuses with the female germ cell or the female gamete to form the zygote. You can see here, students, I would like to erase it first so that you can understand it. See, so we have, let me just see, students, we have two male gametes, fine, within this pollen tube. Now what happens? One of the pollen, this grain or the male gamete get fused up with the egg. You can see here egg. Fine. So the fusion of this polar nuclei with the egg results in the formation of zygote. Remember this thing. And this is what we called as fertilization. So this process is said to be fertilization. Remember this thing. The fusion of male gamete, or we can say the male germ cell, with the female gamete or female germ cell, that is an egg, it's said to be fertilization. Fine, students. And let me just show you here with the help of the example. See, students, this is what your structure looks like, the embryo sac. Fine. So now you can see here, this is the pollen tube, students. Fine. Pollen tube containing two nucleus. Fine. Generative nucleus and tube nucleus. Now what happens? You can see the internal view now. I would like to zoom here. Would like to zoom it. See, students. Now what happens? Within this ovule, one functional megaspore, it keeps on dividing, fine, with the help of mitotic division, and results into the formation of 8 nuclei. Fine. From this one functional megaspore mother cell within this complete ovule, it actually give rise to 8 nuclei. And then what happens? They arrange themselves to the like in the micropillar end and in the chalazial end. So the ovule, we have two ends, micropillar and chalazial end. Fine. So now you can see here that from this 8 nuclei, you can see one is egg. Fine. One is egg. 2 becomes synergids. I am showing you with the help of different color, students. 2 becomes synergids. 2 in the center, they become polar nuclei, right? And 3, you can see here in this end, they become antipodal. Fine. Now what happens? According to your class, that is 10th standard, you just need to know this thing only. Fine. That one functional megaspore keeps on dividing mitotically. Fine. And give results into 8 nuclei. Fine. The arrangement of 8 nuclei I have already shown you, students. 1 become egg. In this end, you can see here 2 become synergids. Then in the upper end, you can see 3 antipodal cells are there. Fine. Now what happens? See, one of the nuclei, you can see here, one of the nuclei, that is the generative nucleus. Fine. It get fused up with this egg. So this egg plus one male gamete give rise to the syngamy, or simply we can say fertilization. Fine. The other name of this fertilization, we sometimes call it as syngamy. So both terms are interrelated, they both are same. This is what the process is, fertilization. Fine. Remember this thing. Then you can see here we have another nucleus in that pollen tube, that is the tube nucleus. Fine. We have 2 sperm nucleus here. Now this complete nuclei, the tube nucleus, it get fused up with these 2 polar nuclei. Fine. Then 2 plus 1 is 3. So we get triple or triploid, that is represented by the 3N endosperm. Fine. Endosperm. So this is what. Now, as you can see, 2 times fertilization is taking place. The first fertilization is this one generative nuclei with the egg. Fine. With the egg cell. Then the another one is with 2 polar nuclei. Fine. So it becomes triploid endosperm. Now what is the function of this triploid endosperm? It will be giving nourishment to the developing embryo. Fine. Once the complete process is formed, once the embryo is formed, so embryo needs some nourishment, and that will be given by this triploid endosperm. Fine. I hope this thing is clear, students, because this thing is very important. This is what the double fertilization is. Okay. You can see here in this diagram as well. This is pollen tube, students. Okay. You can see the pollen tube is germinating. Now, you can see 2 sperm nuclei are there within this pollen tube. I hope I am clear, students. This complete structure is ovary. Within this ovary, you can see we have ovule, right? And I've already explained you the structure. We have this antipodal cells, we have egg, synergids, and 2 polar nuclei. Now what exactly happens? One sperm fertilizes the egg cell and one sperm fertilizes the central cell, that is the polar nuclei. Fine. So this is what the triploid endosperm and this is what the syngamy is. Together they are said to be double fertilization. Right, students? I hope I am clear because this is very, very important phenomena. Fine. This is very, very important. So I hope the topic is clear to each one of you. We have studied the two asexual mode that are the vegetative propagation plus the fragmentation in Spirogyra. Another thing that we have studied is very, very important topic, that is sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Fine, the complete structure of flower and what exactly do we mean by the double fertilization and also the germination of pollen tube on stigma. Now students, what happens? You can see here, after fertilization, the zygote is being formed, students. The fusion of male and female gamete results into the formation of zygote. So this zygote divides several times and form embryo. Fine, forms embryo. Now embryo within the ovule only, and students, the ovule develops a tough coat and is gradually converted into a seed. And one more important thing, the ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form the fruit. Now the seed contains the future plant or embryo which develops into a seedling under appropriate condition, and this process is said to be germination. So remember this very important step, students, that your ovule, you can see here ovule, within this ovule, students, let me just erase it for you so that you can better understand it, because this is very important topic. See students, you can see this one is ovule, so this ovule develops into seed. Fine, seed, and this ovary becomes fruit. So if you are eating a tomato, if you are eating a mango, you must have seen this fleshy portion is ovary that you are eating, and internal seed like structure, that is ovule. Fine. So I hope the topic is clear to each one of you students. Thank you.